By the second week of September, cars nobody recognized were parking along the gravel shoulder of Route 9, half a mile before the turnoff to Coldiron Hollow. Nobody had posted anything online. Nobody had put up a sign. But word moves through a mountain county, the way water moves through limestone, quietly underground, and it always finds a way out. What people wanted to know was simple. What in God's name was Everett Pruitt doing on 60 acres of rock and hardwood that every soul in that county had written off 20 years ago as good for nothing but firewood and squirrel hunting? A man in a clean pickup with Ohio plates had been seen parked at the mouth of the hollow 3 separate times, just sitting there, watching the tree line. Dale Sexton, who ran cattle on the ridge above and hadn't said 10 words to Everett since a fence dispute back in 2011, had started walking the property line at dusk, squinting into the trees like he was looking for something he already suspected was there. A woman from the State Department of Agriculture had driven up from Frankfurt twice in 1 month. And somebody, nobody would say who, had been caught with a shovel and a headlamp on Everett's land at 2 in the morning. And by sunrise the whole county knew about it, even though the sheriff's report wouldn't be filed for 3 more days. 3 questions hung over that hollow like fog over the ridgeline. What was growing under those trees that people were willing to trespass and risk jail to get to? Why had a man everyone considered half crazy for buying that land suddenly become the most talked-about farmer in the county? And why, through all of it, did Everett Pruitt refuse to say one single word about what he'd spent 9 years building in the dark, under the canopy, where nobody thought to look? If you believe the land nobody wants can turn out to be the land worth the most, subscribe and stick around. Drop the state or country you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing where this community reaches. Your corner of the world might get featured in a future story. Everett Pruitt was 63 years old, and for most of those years he'd made the kind of quiet, deliberate decisions that people around him either didn't notice or didn't understand. Not until it was too late to learn from him instead of just talking about him. He'd grown up in Harlan County, the second son of an underground coal miner who worked 31 years for the same company and died owing the company store more than his life insurance paid out. Everett remembered the funeral more clearly than he remembered most of his childhood, not because it was sad though it was, but because of what his mother said afterward. Sitting at the kitchen table, with the bills spread out in front of her like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. Your daddy worked every day of his life for people who owned him before he ever signed a thing. Everett swore at 17 years old that he would never build his life on ground or debt that belonged to somebody else. It didn't stop him from going into the mines himself. Work was work, and Harlan County didn't hand out other options. He spent 28 years underground, first as a roof bolter, later running a continuous miner, until a combination of black lung and a collapsed section in his lower back ended that chapter for good at 54. He took the settlement, took the pension, and did something that made half his family question his judgment. He bought land that nobody else wanted. 60 acres in Coldiron Hollow, 2 counties over from where he'd grown up, a steep, timbered, mostly north-facing slope. A thin ribbon of bottomland along the creek that flooded every spring, and soil so thin and rocky in places that a fence post driver would hit stone 18 inches down. The previous owner, an estate sale nobody local wanted to touch, had let it sit untouched for over a decade. The listing had called it recreational timber acreage. Everyone in the county called it something less generous. Everett paid $95,000 for it, cash from the settlement, and moved into the old tin-roofed farmhouse at the mouth of the hollow before the ink on the deed was dry. His daughter, Rosalind, drove up from Lexington the first weekend and stood on the porch looking at the tree line for a long time before she said anything. "Daddy, there's nothing here to farm, it's just woods." "That's what everybody keeps telling me," Everett said. He'd looked at 11 other properties before Coldiron Hollow, most of them the kind of land a retired miner with a settlement check was supposed to buy, flat bottom land near a highway. A few acres already cleared, something a bank would call a safe investment. Every one of those properties had come with a mortgage, and every mortgage had come with a payment schedule that would follow him for 15 or 20 years. Everett didn't want 15 or 20 years of owing a bank the way his father had owed a coal company. The realtor who finally showed him the hollow apologized for even including it on the list. "It's rough ground," she told him on the drive up. "Steep, thin soil in spots, floods a little along the creek in spring. I mostly show it because the timber rights alone are worth something if a man wanted to log it off and sell the land bare." Everett had walked the property alone for nearly 3 hours that first visit off the trail off the drive. Climbing the north slope on his hands and knees in places, running his fingers through the leaf litter, tasting the air, the way old miners learn to taste rock dust before they can name what kind it is. He didn't say much to the realtor when he came back down. He just asked her to draw up the paperwork. His brother, still living in Harlan, called him a fool over the phone that same week. "You had good money, Ev, you could have bought something that pays you back." "I intend to," Everett said, and left it at that. For the first 18 months, most of the county assumed Everett had simply retired into the woods to be left alone, the way some old miners did once the work had taken what it was going to take from a man's lungs. Nobody asked him directly what he meant to do with 60 acres of standing timber, mostly because the answer seemed obvious. Cut it, sell the logs, maybe run a few goats on the cleared ground. That's what land like that was for. When Everett didn't cut a single tree, people stopped asking and started guessing instead, which in a small county is a far more dangerous thing. Some guessed he was sitting on mineral rights, waiting on a coal company to come sniffing around, the way companies still occasionally did in that part of the state. Others guessed he was simply too proud or too stubborn to admit he'd made a bad investment. Everett let every guess stand uncorrected. He'd learned long before he ever bought that land that explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think rarely changes a mind. And it almost always costs you the one thing you can't get back once it's gone, the element of surprise. If you've never stood at the mouth of an Appalachian hollow before first light in October, it's hard to explain what Everett saw every morning that most people never bothered to notice. The fog didn't fall so much as pool. It gathered low along the creek bed first, then crept up through the understory like it had somewhere to be, wrapping around the trunks of shagbark hickory and yellow poplar until the whole hollow looked like it was breathing. The canopy up top was mostly sugar maple and white oak, old growth mixed with second growth, dense enough in summer that almost no direct sun reached the forest floor. The leaf litter underneath was thick, years, maybe decades, of undisturbed decay, dark and soft and smelling like something older than the county itself. Everett was always up before the birds. Thermos of black coffee in one hand, a soil probe and a folded topographic map in the other, walking the slopes with a headlamp turned low, checking things nobody else thought to check. Canopy density, leaf mold depth. The angle of the slope, the direction it faced, the calcium content of the rock underneath. He was looking for something specific, and it wasn't visible from the road, and it wasn't anything you could plant in a straight row with a tractor. Dale Sexton's cattle operation sat on 400 acres up on the ridge above the hollow, open pasture, round bales stacked for winter, a new equipment shed he'd financed the year before. Dale had looked at the same 60 acres in the hollow 2 years before Everett bought it. He'd walked it once, shook his head, and told the real estate agent it wasn't worth what the county was asking in property tax, let alone the sale price. Can't run cattle on a 45-degree slope, Dale told anyone who'd listen at the co-op. Can't farm rock. That land's dead money. That sentence would end up costing Dale more than he expected, not in dollars, but in pride, which in a county like Coldiron sometimes costs a man more. What Everett did with that hollow made no sense to anyone watching from the road, mostly because there was nothing to watch. He didn't clear a single tree. He didn't bring in a tractor. He didn't plant a row crop, didn't build a greenhouse, didn't do anything that resembled farming as the county understood the word. Instead, in year one, he thin-select understory brush by hand, careful not to open the canopy more than a few percentage points. He tested soil pH in a dozen different spots along the north-facing slope, sending samples to a lab in Lexington and a second lab in West Virginia just to compare results. He built low deer fencing around 3 separate plots, camouflaged with cut brush so it wouldn't draw the eye from the ridge trail above. He hauled in composted leaf mold from a state forestry contact he'd known since before the mines, working it gently into the natural litter layer without disturbing the forest floor's structure. He wasn't planting anything visible. He was preparing ground that already looked to anyone driving Route 9 exactly like it had for 50 years. He's out there every morning doing something to the dirt under them trees, a neighbor said at the feed store. Man spending money on land he can't even farm. Everett didn't argue. He kept working before sunrise, kept his conversations short, and in the spring of the second year, 3 cardboard boxes arrived at the post office in his name, shipped from a growers' cooperative in Marathon County, Wisconsin. Small, lightweight air-hold marked fragile live rootstock, kept cool in transit. Everett picked them up himself, didn't let the postmaster see what was inside, and carried them up the hollow on foot rather than driving the truck up the old logging trail, so as not to leave fresh tire tracks anyone might notice. He planted by hand, on his knees in the leaf litter, working alone through the last cool days before the ground warmed. He refused help. He refused questions even more firmly. Rosalind came up for a weekend in early June and asked him straight out over supper. "Daddy, what is it? What are you doing up there?" Everett looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup for a long moment. "Something that needs 100 years of somebody not touching it to be worth anything," he said. "And I don't have 100 years. So I'm going to try to fake it." That was all he told her. By the end of that week, the boxes were empty, and whatever had gone into the ground stayed hidden under leaves that looked no different than they had the year before. Rosalind drove back to Lexington that Sunday more frustrated than curious. She called her aunt on the way, half laughing, half worried. "He's talking in riddles up there. I don't know if Daddy's lost his mind or if he's just being Daddy." Her aunt, who'd known Everett since before the mines, laughed for a long moment before answering. "Honey, your daddy has been playing a long game since he was 17 years old. The trick with your daddy is you don't get to see the board until he's good and ready to show you." Back at the hollow, the work that followed didn't look like much to an outsider. Everett spent that third year walking the plots almost daily, checking soil moisture with a hand probe, watching for signs of fungal disease that could wipe out years of patient investment overnight, adjusting the brush cover over the deer fencing as the seasons changed. He kept a logbook, a plain composition notebook, the same kind he'd once used underground to track roof conditions, filled with dates, weather, soil readings, and small sketches of plot boundaries. Nobody else ever saw that notebook. He kept it locked in the bottom drawer of an old roll-top desk that had belonged to his father, one of the only things Everett had kept from the house he grew up in. By the fourth year, small green shoots had emerged beneath the canopy in each of the three plots, three-pronged at first, then developing the distinctive five-leaflet compound leaves as the plants matured. To anyone who didn't know exactly what they were looking for, they were indistinguishable from a dozen other native forest plants. Everett had counted on that. He'd chosen his plots specifically in places where the natural understory already included similar-looking foliage, a kind of camouflage that required no fencing or signage to work. He turned down two separate offers that year from neighbors interested in leasing hunting rights on the property, worried that hunters tramping through the hollow in blaze orange might disturb the plots, or worse, notice something they shouldn't. He turned down a timber buyer's cold call as well, a company offering what sounded like good money for select hardwood harvest rights. Everett didn't need the money badly enough to risk opening the canopy even a few percentage points more than necessary. What Everett understood, and what almost nobody in Coldiron County understood, was that the most valuable plant in North American agriculture doesn't grow in a field, doesn't grow in the sun, and doesn't grow fast. American ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, has been harvested out of Appalachian forests for nearly 300 years, shipped overseas to herbal medicine markets in China, South Korea, and Hong Kong, where wild simulated roots command prices that dwarf almost anything else that comes off American soil by weight. Cultivated ginseng, grown under artificial shade cloth in open fields, sells for a fraction of the price. Wild ginseng, or roots grown to mimic wild conditions, planted under natural forest canopy and left largely undisturbed for 8 to 12 years, sells for far more. Because the root develops the slow growth rings, the twisted neck, and the chemical concentration that buyers overseas are willing to pay a premium for. Everett had learned all of this decades earlier, almost by accident, from an old-timer back in Harlan who dug wild ginseng on the side to supplement his mining wages. What Everett understood that most people didn't was patience, real patience. The kind that doesn't pay anything back for the better part of a decade, the kind that requires a man to trust a process he can't see and can't rush, and can't explain to his own daughter without sounding half out of his mind. Every choice he'd made on that hollow served the plant. The north-facing slope kept the ground cooler and slowed evaporation. The dense hardwood canopy, 75 to 80% shade, mimicked exactly the light conditions the plant would find growing wild. The calcium-rich limestone soil, the kind most farmers considered worthless for row crops, was precisely what ginseng needed to thrive. The leaf litter he'd carefully preserved and enriched fed the plant slowly, the way 100 years of undisturbed forest floor would. Even the deer fencing, hidden and unobtrusive, protected a crop that browsing animals found irresistible. The hollow that Dale Sexton had dismissed as dead money had something nobody else had recognized. Nearly undisturbed old-growth forest, the exact soil chemistry, and an owner willing to wait a decade for a payday most farmers wouldn't consider a payday at all. Dale Sexton was not a cruel man. He was a certain kind of farmer, the kind who measured a season by tonnage and a farm by acreage, who traded in his equipment every few years, who believed in doing things bigger and faster rather than slower and stranger. He ran 400 acres of cattle and hay, carried a note at the bank that kept him up some nights, and had strong opinions about every operation in the county, which he shared freely whether asked or not. When the soil consultant's truck started showing up at the mouth of Everett's Hollow, Dale noticed. When the Department of Agriculture car came through twice in 1 month, Dale noticed that too. He drove past the hollow entrance 3 times in a single week, slowing each time, squinting into the tree line like the trees themselves might give something up. When the Wisconsin boxes came through the post office, word got to Dale within 2 days. He asked around at the feed store. Nobody had answers, which only made him more determined to find one. He eventually called an old friend, a conservation officer with the state, and asked, half joking and half not, whether Everett Pruitt had the proper permits for whatever he was doing back in that hollow. He did. Everything Everett had filed, forestry management plans, the voluntary ginseng grower registration through the State Department of Agriculture, even paperwork anticipating an eventual harvest, was in order, filed years ahead of anyone needing to ask. Dale went home with no answers and told his wife that Pruitt was up to something that was going to cost him every dollar of that mining settlement. His wife, who'd gone to high school with Everett 35 years earlier, said nothing back. She'd learned a long time ago that some men only look reckless right up until the moment they're proven right. Dale wasn't the only one watching, though he was the most persistent. The soil consultant's repeat visits had drawn attention from a small circle of local hunters who used the ridge trail above the hollow, and a couple of them had mentioned almost in passing that something about the understory in a few specific patches looked different than it used to, thicker, greener, oddly consistent in a way undisturbed forest rarely is. Nobody put the pieces together yet. Coldiron County had plenty of odd hobbies and odder hobbyists, and Everett Pruitt digging around in the dirt before sunrise didn't strike most people as worth more than a passing comment at the diner. The county extension office was a different matter. A young agent named Priya Raman, newer to the district, had processed Everett's voluntary grower registration paperwork back in year 2, and had quietly kept an eye on the file ever since, more out of professional curiosity than anything else. Wild simulated ginseng operations weren't common in Coldiron, and a well-documented one, run with the kind of meticulous record-keeping Everett brought to it, was rare enough that she mentioned it to her supervisor more than once. She never told anyone in the community what she knew. It wasn't her place to, and Everett had been clear from the start that he wanted the operation kept quiet until harvest. "You understand why?" Everett told her the one time she asked directly, standing at the mouth of the hollow with a clipboard in hand. "Anybody who knows what's back there and doesn't have a reason to be honest about it becomes a problem I don't need." Priya understood better than most. She'd grown up 2 counties over, in a family that had lost ginseng patches to poachers more than once, and she filed Everett's paperwork without comment, the way he'd asked. By year 7, something had changed in the hollow that even the most casual observer could sense, even if they couldn't name it. The understory in 3 specific patches had thickened, not dramatically, not in a way that would catch a passing glance, but enough that anyone who knew what wild ginseng looked like might recognize the distinctive whorled leaves and the small clusters of red berries that appeared each August. And in a county like Coldiron, there are always a few people who know exactly what wild ginseng looks like, because sang hunting has been a fall tradition in these mountains for longer than anyone living can remember. Most diggers are honest, working within the legal season, respecting posted land. A few are not. It happened in early September of year 8. Everett's trail cameras, small battery-powered units he'd mounted on trees around the perimeter of his largest plot 2 years earlier. After losing a handful of roots to an unknown digger, caught a man in dark clothing working by headlamp at just past 2 in the morning, a mesh dig bag already half full slung over one shoulder, a hand trowel in the other. Everett didn't confront him that night. He called the sheriff's office instead, along with the state conservation officer he'd built a relationship with over the years of proper permitting. And by morning there was a report on file and a name attached to the grainy trail camera footage. A man from 2 counties over with a known history of poaching wild ginseng off other people's land. Someone who'd made a habit of scouting isolated hollows and hitting them before legal season even opened. Word of the break-in moved through the county fast, and for the first time people weren't just curious about what was growing in Everett's hollow. They understood suddenly that it was worth stealing. Dale Sexton, walking his own fence line 2 mornings later, spotted fresh boot prints crossing from Everett's property onto his own pasture edge, the same man, apparently scouting a second approach. Dale didn't think twice. He called Everett directly for the first time in years, and the 2 men walked the boundary together at first light, comparing notes, until they found where the fence had been cut and quietly repaired it themselves before either the sheriff or the game warden even arrived. They didn't say much to each other while they worked, but by the time they finished, something between them had shifted that neither one bothered to put into words. By the last week of September in year 9, the hollow changed in a way that finally made the secret impossible to keep. The ginseng berries, clustered bright red against the deep green whorled leaves, had ripened across all 3 plots at once. And from the ridge trail above, the same trail Dale had been quietly using for years, the color was unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Rosalind drove up from Lexington that weekend. And when Everett finally walked her down into the largest plot and knelt beside a cluster of mature plants, brushing leaf litter away from a root system that had been growing undisturbed for the better part of a decade, she didn't say anything for a long moment. The roots themselves, when Everett finally allowed himself to dig a single test plant to check maturity, told the story better than any conversation could. Gnarled, twisted, marked with the slow concentric growth rings that only come from a decade of unhurried development in ideal conditions. A shape and density that cultivated field-grown ginseng could never replicate, no matter how it was grown or how old it got. 9 years, Everett said, turning the root over in his palm. 9 years and it's not even done yet. Wild simulated ginseng harvest in Kentucky follows a legal season that opens September 1st and runs through the end of the year. And Everett had spent nearly a decade making sure every piece of paperwork was in order for the day he'd finally be allowed to dig. The harvest itself took 11 days. Roots have to be removed carefully by hand, with the seed berries replanted immediately nearby to ensure the patch could regenerate for future seasons, a practice Everett insisted on even though nobody was checking. Rosalind came up for the full stretch and brought two friends from Lexington who'd never dug ginseng before in their lives. They worked in near silence in the early mornings, headlamps low, moving carefully through the leaf litter, learning quickly not to damage a root that had taken 9 years to grow. Word had already gotten out by then, and it traveled fast once the digging started. A ginseng buyer from a licensed dealership in West Virginia, the kind of outfit that exports directly to herbal medicine markets overseas, made the 2-hour drive after hearing rumors from a supplier contact. He walked the drying racks Everett had set up in the old tobacco barn, examined a handful of roots under a loupe, and made an offer on the spot that Everett didn't accept until the full harvest and drying process was complete. A second buyer called from Ohio. A pharmacist in Lexington who dealt in herbal supplements reached out asking about smaller quantities for local sale. The county extension office, which had quietly known about the project for 2 years through Everett's own permitting paperwork, asked if they could feature the operation in an upcoming forestry newsletter. When the final weights came in after proper drying, root weight dropped significantly once cured, sometimes to a third of fresh weight. Everett had just under 19 pounds of dried wild simulated American ginseng root. At prices ranging between $500 and just over $1,000 per pound for high-grade, properly aged wild simulated roots sold to a reputable dealer, the single harvest brought in more than double what Everett had originally paid for the entire 60 acres 9 years earlier. He didn't celebrate loudly. He never had. He paid the buyer's driver a cup of coffee for the trip, walked the drying barn one more time after the trucks left, and sat on the tailgate of his own pickup a long while. Looking up toward the tree line, where 3 empty plots now sat resting, already reseeded, already waiting on the next decade. Word of the sale spread through Coldiron faster than the harvest itself had. The diner in town added a line to the specials board joking about hollow money, and for a few weeks Everett couldn't stop into the hardware store without somebody asking, half joking and half serious, whether he had a spare acre of woods he wasn't using. He turned every offer down politely. He wasn't interested in leasing land to strangers who'd want results in 2 years instead of 10. The buyer from West Virginia came back a second time that November, not for business, but out of what he admitted was plain curiosity, wanting to see the plots themselves rather than just the dried root. Everett walked him up the hollow in the cold, showing him the deer fencing, the trail camera mounts, the roll-top desk drawer with 9 years of handwritten logbooks stacked inside. The buyer, who'd spent 30 years in the ginseng trade and had seen every kind of grower from careless to obsessive, told Everett flatly that he'd rarely seen documentation that thorough outside of a university research plot. Most fellas doing wild simulated just planted in hope, the buyer said. You ran this like it was a science. It was underground work before it was woods work, Everett told him. You learn to write everything down when the ground can kill you for guessing wrong. The conservation officer who'd handled the poaching report stopped by that same month, not on official business, just to let Everett know the man caught on his trail camera had been formally charged and had a prior conviction 2 counties over for the same offense. It wasn't much of a resolution legally speaking. A fine, a suspended sentence, a ban from applying for any state ginseng harvest permit for 5 years, but it was enough to close the chapter. And enough that Everett stopped checking his trail cameras every single morning out of habit. Dale Sexton didn't say much publicly in the weeks that followed. Then in late October, he drove down the hollow road unannounced, parked at the mouth of the property, and asked if Everett had a few minutes. They sat on the porch for close to 2 hours. Everett didn't gloat, it wasn't in him. He walked Dale through the soil testing, the canopy management, the years of watching and waiting, the permits filed a decade before there was anything to harvest. Dale asked more questions in that one afternoon than he'd asked another human being in years, and left with a folder of extension office contacts and a promise to look into his own timbered back 40, the 20 acres he'd always considered a waste of a hillside. The state forestry newsletter ran a feature the following spring. Rosalind began making plans to move back from Lexington, splitting her time between the city and the hollow, learning the operation from her father with an eye toward eventually taking it over. Everett was already 3 plots deep into a second cycle by the time the article was published. Younger stands this time, seeded with root from his own harvest, another 8 or 9 years out from maturity, patient as ever. The land in Coldiron Hollow had never been the limitation. It never is. What was missing for decades was somebody willing to look at ground everybody else had given up on and ask what it might become if somebody finally gave it the time it needed. Rosalind ended up splitting her time between Lexington and the Hollow for 2 full years, before she made it permanent, moving into a small cabin she and Everett built together near the mouth of the property, close enough to the old farmhouse that they still shared supper most nights. Far enough that she had a place of her own. She kept her father's habit of the composition notebooks, though she'd started scanning the pages into a spreadsheet too, something Everett grumbled about but never told her to stop. By the time the second cycle of plots reached its 4th year, Coldiron County had 2 other landowners quietly attempting their own wild simulated patches. both of them having sat on Everett's porch at some point, asking careful questions about canopy density and soil calcium the way Dale once had. Everett answered every question he was asked, same as he had with Dale, though he made a point of telling each of them the same thing before they left. "It's not going to make you rich in year 2, he'd say. "If that's what you're after, this isn't your crop." Dale's own hillside acreage, the 20 he'd once called a waste of a slope, took root a full 3 years behind Everett's second cycle, planted with seed stock Everett gave him at cost rather than sold. The two men walked both hollows together most Sunday mornings now, checking fence lines, comparing notebook entries, saying very little, the way men who have earned each other's trust the hard way tend to talk. Everett was 63 when the first harvest came in, and he liked to tell people, on the rare occasions he told them anything at all, that the hollow had taught him the same lesson twice, once underground, and once under a 100-year-old canopy of oak and maple. Some of the most valuable things a person can build take longer than most people are willing to wait, and the ground that looks like it has nothing left to give is sometimes just waiting on somebody patient enough to ask it the right question. The question worth sitting with isn't what a piece of land is worth right now, at first glance from the road. It's what it might be capable of, given to someone patient enough to actually find out.